Years later, when she reminisced about the long summer of her 18th year, she could hardly recall the feeling of leaving that small town for the first time. A 5-year age gap isn't really that big, but for someone 18 and another 23, it felt like they belonged to two different generations. She didn't know what to call him. A brother, an uncle. So, during the 2 weeks they spent together doing nothing in particular, she never used any titles at all. Conversations would start with you, or maybe I, and his name was only mentioned at their first meeting. The pronunciation of his name, which she hadn't practiced much during that time, naturally faded from her memory, leaving behind only a vague awareness of his surname. "I have a lot of money," he said, looking at her. An 18-year-old is not a child and understands everything. She knew what he was implying with his undertone. "Let's leave together." But where? The car roamed aimlessly through the city, and over those 2 weeks, she became thoroughly familiar with almost all the road signs. She even knew to turn left at the next junction, and that after about 20 more minutes, they would arrive at the seaside. She was still angry at the time, sitting sideways, not looking at him, watching his movements through the car window's reflection, seeing him take off his suit jacket and drape it over her back, seeing him reach out wanting to touch her face. She turned her head, and then he quietly withdrew his hand. What exactly was she mad about? She couldn't even clarify now. The alley was dark as she dashed across, her hand outstretched to block those attempting to further shame him, her eyes glaring furiously at them.
"Utter another word, I dare you!"
She roared at them, her voice blurred by rage.
"I've already called the police."
The aggressors left, cursing under their breath. To be seen in such a state was deeply embarrassing for him. But at that moment, he could hardly stand, his knees aching from kneeling. He looked pleadingly at the girl before him, perhaps begging her to help him up, perhaps wishing she hadn't appeared, wishing she would leave. Yet, she squatted down, starting with the tone he least wanted to hear.
"Are you hurt?"
An explanation was his to render, of his present degradation, why adorned in finery he knelt, a subject to scorn and blows. Could this figure before her be the same known to her heart? She inquired not of the cause. In his eyes, her curiosity bore not the weight of fervor, as if his presence in her life had been but a fleeting guise, an elder brother of acquaintance briefly crossing paths. In times hence, pondering upon that day, he found himself bewildered at the memory. Why did she weep? He thought, exposing himself unintentionally before her like this was indeed too embarrassing.
But hey, I guess that's us.
He waited for her downstairs. Her hair had quietly grown much longer, the bangs now long enough to sweep aside. He remembered their first meeting, when her bangs made her look like a well-behaved girl. And she got into the car, just like they had done on so many drives over the last 2 weeks. The scenery outside whizzed past in reverse, including all the familiar streets, like the alley they passed by downstairs, the one she had helped him back through one night to apply medicine to his wounds, inexplicably crying as she did.
Love you in the nighttime, leave you in your bed, cold and wanting more. Oh, and I should know this could never work.
The car crossed the sea bridge,
Never end well.
briefly revealing the beach they'd visited countless times.
But I never learned.
She wasn't much for swimming.
Myself.
It was mostly his figure that played in the
I
waves.
can take the fall, the pain, the pleasure, and you can take it.
All of these moments began to slowly fade over the following years. The world wasn't just that beach and that alley anymore. She finally flipped through the nearly blank pages of her notebook.
Then we won't make it.
So, will you forget all this?
I guess that
It encompassed everything from 18. The dim alley, the long, damp coastline, and her first impression of him as cool, which satisfied all her initial fantasies. He had a blend of remaining flamboyance and a newfound calmness. That was the person she wanted to be back then.
I can take the fall, the pain, the pleasure, and you can take it all, for worse or better. But oh, what if we're wrong? What if we're not all that we thought? Then we won't make it along. But hey, I guess that's love.